The air around the gathering felt heavier now, though no one could explain why the colonel still held a smirk, but it was no longer easy. It trembled slightly as if uncertain of its own strength. The veteran did not move. He simply stood there, his back straight. His eyes fixed somewhere past the colonel, like he was watching a memory come alive beyond the crowd. The sound of the ocean carried through the cold air, a slow, rolling rhythm that seemed to echo the silence that had settled between them. The younger officers looked at each other, their laughter fading as unease began to spread among them like mist creeping along the deck. The colonel cleared his throat as if to break the strange tension. He asked the veteran what unit he had. Served with hoping to regain his confident tone, the veteran replied that he had served where no flags were flown and where names were not spoken. The colonel tried to chuckle again, but the sound faltered halfway. His voice cracked, and it hung there, weak and uncertain. The intelligence officer, who had recognized the insignia, said nothing. His eyes locked on the veteran with a mixture of disbelief and something that looked very much like respect. The veteran lowered his sleeve again, hiding the faint mark on his arm. The crowd had no idea what it meant, but the officer from intelligence knew he had seen that symbol only once before in a classified report buried so deep it was said to exist only as rumor. The colonel shifted his weight, his confidence draining with every second. He tried to brush it off with another joke, saying it sounded like a ghost story. The veteran did not answer his expression, calm as if he had heard such mockery before. One of the junior Marines whispered, asking what Delta meant, but his superior silenced him quickly, eyes darting toward the colonel. The intelligence officer took a slow step back, pulling out his phone, pretending to check a message, but his hand shook slightly. The colonel noticed and, for the first time, wondered if he had gone too far. The veteran finally spoke again, his voice low, almost lost beneath the crash of the waves. He said some of us served in the dark, so others could stand in the light. Those words lingered heavy like fog. The colonel stared at him, unsure what to say. For a moment he felt small like a child pretending to wear his father's uniform. The veteran looked away toward the flagpole where the wind tugged at the colors, the folds snapping sharply in the cold morning air. He said nothing more yet. His silence said everything. The intelligence officer took another step forward, his face pale, his mouth opening then closing again as if he wanted to speak but dared not. The colonel felt his heart beating, faster. It was strange how the quiet could feel louder than any shout around them. The ceremony continued, though few paid attention. Now the band played in the distance, the notes carried off by the wind, people clapped for a speech they were not listening. To the colonel felt eyes on him, but none of them friendly anymore. He forced a laugh, trying to turn the attention away. He said that everyone here had served and that old stories were meant to stay in the past. But as he looked at the veteran, he saw something in the man's eyes that froze him. It was not anger, it was not pride. It was something deeper, like sorrow mixed with a quiet warning. The veteran's hands were steady, his posture straight. He looked every bit a man who had faced things. Others could not imagine the colonel remembered the way the younger Marines had laughed earlier, and he felt a pang of guilt. Though he did not know why, the veteran turned his head slightly and said softly, "Some of us never came back, though we are. Standing here?" The colonel blinked, not understanding what that meant exactly, but the words clawed at the edges of his mind. The intelligence officer finally stepped forward, his voice trembling as he addressed the colonel, saying, "Sir, with respect, perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere private." The colonel frowned, confused, and asked why the officer hesitated. Glancing at the veteran, and then at the colonel again, he said, "Because some things are not meant to be discussed in public." The colonel frowned deeper. His pride stung. He said it was only a joke, but the veteran's gaze held him, and he felt the words die in his throat. The veteran spoke again, saying, "It is never a joke when you mock the dead." The colonel's breath caught, and a shiver ran through him, though the air was not that cold anymore. The intelligence officer lowered his eyes as if remembering something. The younger Marines looked uneasy. One of them asked quietly, "Sir, what does Delta Force Actual mean?" The colonel did not answer. He could not. The veteran finally moved, stepping closer, not in aggression, but with the kind of quiet authority that made every man there stand straighter. He said some units are not named because names are too small for what they must carry. The colonel felt his throat tighten. He wanted to ask more, but something inside him warned him not to. The veteran continued speaking slowly, saying that he had buried more men than he could count, and that their stories were never told because that was the way of their work. The colonel looked into his eyes and saw no boast, no pride, only a shadow that never left. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of salt and fuel from the harbor. The veteran turned slightly as if listening to a sound far away. Perhaps memory? Perhaps nothing at all. The colonel said quietly, "You were in the black operations, weren't you?" The veteran said, "I was, where your reports ended." The colonel did not reply, his chest heavy with the weight of something. He did not understand. The intelligence officer finally said, "Sir, if this is who I believe it is, then we are standing in front of a man whose existence was once considered classified." A murmur spread among the gathered Marines, but the colonel said nothing. He simply nodded slowly, realizing too late that his words had touched a place no one should touch. The veteran gave a small nod, almost like forgiveness, then turned his gaze back to the flag. The colonel swallowed hard and said, "Thank you for your service." But even as he said it, he knew it sounded hollow. The veteran smiled faintly, not unkindly, but with the weary patience of someone who had heard it too many times. He said, "Service is not something you thank someone for. It is something you live with." The crowd began to drift as the ceremony concluded, yet the air remained thick with what had passed. The colonel stood there long after others left, watching the veteran walk toward the pier. The intelligence officer lingered nearby, saying quietly, "You should not have asked him that." The colonel asked why, and the officer said, "Because men like him do not speak unless there is a reason." The colonel looked again at the figure moving toward the edge of the water. Slow, deliberate, unhurried, as if time itself obeyed his pace. The veteran paused at the end of the dock, turning his head just enough for the light to catch his face. For an instant, the colonel saw the faint outline of a scar near his temple, old and deep like a reminder, carved by years of silence. Then the veteran looked out to sea, and the colonel could not shake the feeling that he was not looking at the horizon, but at ghosts. Only he could see. The colonel exhaled, the wind stealing the sound away. "The intelligence," officer said quietly. "Delta Force Actual, sir. That title means he was the one in command." The colonel turned pale, realizing that the man he had joked about outranked him in ways the uniform could never show. He wanted to call out to him to apologize. Again. But the veteran was already walking away, disappearing into the haze that hung above the water. The colonel stood there long after the sound of boots faded, wondering how many times he had shaken the hand of history without knowing it, and how many ghosts stood beside him when he laughed. The wind blew harder as the veteran disappeared beyond the pier, and the colonel stood frozen, feeling a strange emptiness settle in his chest. The intelligence officer remained nearby, silent, watching. "The same fading silhouette," the colonel whispered. What did he mean? Delta Force Actual? And the officer replied that it was not a title. It was a warning. The colonel frowned, his pride still clinging to the last fragments of certainty. But deep down, he knew he had just stood before something far greater than rank. As the ceremony ended, the younger Marines drifted away, murmuring among themselves. The colonel could feel their glances, but no one dared approach him. He walked slowly toward the base, building his steps heavy, his mind replaying every word the veteran had said. He could not shake the tone of those words, soft but weighted like steel, hidden beneath cloth. He entered his office, closed the door, and leaned against it, trying to steady. His breath he turned to the window and saw the ocean stretching out endless and cold. He thought about all the missions he had commanded, all the decisions he had made from the safety of reports and screens and maps, and he wondered how many of those lines had been drawn by men like that, veteran men whose names were never written, whose stories were never told. He remembered the insignia, faint and strange, and how the intelligence officer had gone pale at the sight of it. He sat down at his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a worn folder marked Restricted. He looked at the first page and saw the same symbol drawn faintly in the corner. His heart began to race. He turned the page and read a brief summary of an operation long classified. It spoke of a commander, known only by call sign Delta Actual, who had led a rescue deep in hostile territory decades ago. The details were blacked out, but the closing line remained legible. It read, "Mission successful. All personnel recovered commanding. Officer presumed deceased." The colonel stared at those words for a long time, the sound of the sea filling the silence like an endless heartbeat. He realized then that the man he had mocked had been listed as dead.